Welcome to Mormon Book Reviews, where an evangelical encounters the restoration. I'm your host, Steven Pynakker, and I'm really excited to introduce a new guest here on our platform, Taylor Petrey, who's very much involved in the Mormon studies community, is a professor of religion at Kalamazoo College. Welcome to the program, my friend.
Thank you, Steven. It's really great to be here.
And you have this really interesting book, and we're going to get into the book, but I actually want to kind of have people to get know Taylor a little better. He just recently came out with this book, Queering Kinship in the Mormon Cosmos, published by the University of North Carolina Press. And I also want to share one quick thing here too, because actually you're known for writing a book 4 years ago called Tabernacles of Clay: Sexuality and Gender in Modern Mormonism. Now, what makes this so interesting is I before we get I actually want to ask you about why is a straight male writing queer books, right? I mean, it's kind of an interesting question, and we'll get to that. But before we do, I actually just want to kind of get to know your background a little bit within the your religious upbringing, and maybe just tell us a little bit about your past and what led you in to get into this field in the first place.
Oh, where to start? So I'm Latter-day Saint, raised Latter-day Saint. I grew up in South Jordan, Utah, and I was on the debate team in my high school, and that led me to traveling around the country. Actually, I was very fortunate to be on a really good team at the time, and I ended up getting recruited to debate at a school in New York City, where I ended up there for my undergraduate. And I went on my mission to Italy, came back, and took a religion class, thinking, this might be something I'm interested in studying a little bit more. And after 2 days, I said, this is what I want to do the rest of my life, and the rest is history, I suppose. I'm one of those lucky people that figured out what I wanted to do and was able to actually make it all happen. So yeah, I then graduated there and went on to Harvard Divinity School, where I earned a master's and then a doctorate of theology, studying New Testament and early Christianity. But I was always very interested, of course, in Latter-day Saint ideas, Latter-day Saint history, Latter-day Saint thought, and decided to kind of dip my toes into that field a little bit on the side, and it ended up growing and growing, and I haven't stopped writing or thinking about it since then. But I actually work in two fields. I work in early Christianity and in Mormonism, Mormon studies. So that's a little bit of my academic and religious background in the very briefest possible summary there.
So you say you specialize also in I'm always fascinated by early Christianity. What is it about early Christianity that interests you so much?
Yeah. I think that I originally got into it with a set of assumptions or a set of hopes that it would answer all of my theological and historical and doctrinal questions, or something along those lines, that the origins would provide the truth. And instead, I became fascinated by the story of how this faith is developing. What are the problems that they're facing? What kinds of smart ways are they kind of trying to address the issues of their days, and what are the lessons that we might learn from that today? So I ended up coming at it from a different perspective as I sort of matured in the field, and have really kind of been focused on the second century specifically as the time period that I think is kind of the most formative and the most interesting for me. So that's kind of where I spend most of my scholarly time and in my other life there.
Well, within the context of the Latter-day Saint movement, of course, there's this concept called the Great Apostasy. And so I imagine part of you was kind of looking maybe for the roots or the origin of the Great Apostasy by studying early Christianity. And what kind of, just kind of coming in from a Latter-day Saint theological framework and engaging the early Christianity, what kind of findings did you find?
Yeah. Well, I ended up writing about this in a great book that was published maybe about 10 years ago or so now, called Standing Apart. I forget what the subtitle is, but it's published by Oxford University Press. It's a great edited volume, with essays on Latter-day Saint perspectives on the Great Apostasy, and my contribution was about early Christianity. And pretty early on in my graduate studies, abandoned the idea of a historical Great Apostasy, that there was some uh, a clear set of historical ideas that would have been evidence for that. Most of the earlier treatments that had been produced by Latter-day Saints reflected kind of Catholic anti-Protestant, or sorry, the other way around, Protestant anti-Catholic perspectives, and were really a distorted view of church history that most modern scholars had abandoned, including myself, once you kind of actually look at what the evidence is. And in fact, the entire framework or the narrative of the framework of there being a pure original that later, falls into corruption, that's not a historical claim, that's a theological claim. And so I came to kind of approach the whole subject quite differently. And if people are interested, that's my essay is called Purity and Parallels. It's available for free on my academia.edu page if people want to read my thoughts about that.
And if you could send me the link so I could put that in the description, that would be great. And
Will
so
do.
you can access it. So, actually, a year or two ago, I actually had a gentleman who wrote a book for a Catholic publisher, and it's one of the big ones, and I can't remember it off the top of my head, but he basically was a Latter-day Saint, and he converted to Catholicism because when he studied the early church, he was surprised at how Catholic it was, even in its beginning and in its early days. He was expecting to find this great apostasy, and what he found was Catholicism in the early church. Was that kind of something that you found in this journey as well, a little bit?
I think that all of the denominational perspectives all have claims to,
Mhm.
aspects of early Christianity, of things that they will all point to and say, that's our thing that we preserve, right? As historical claims, I'm not really persuaded by any of them. Again, I respect people who sort of find something meaningful there for their faith. There's nothing wrong with that. Latter-day Saints, as well as other religious traditions, all do that. I'm not sure that I ended up finding early Christianity particularly meaningful me as a religious topic. And if anything, it sort of troubled me what I found there more than gave me a sure direction. But anyway, this is a whole other conversation, of
Well,
course.
wait,
But
wait,
yeah,
wait, wait, wait. We have to at least address it. So you said you found things that you found troubling. I'm just
yeah.
kind of curious because this is really, honestly, this channel is for people in many ways. A lot of people are on different faith journeys. Sometimes they're journeying into the church, out of the church, into a different church, becoming atheist. And so, and a lot of it is doing by studying history. So what was it that you found disturbing or just because it's interesting. I just love to go into these uncomfortable spaces sometimes because I think that's really good conversations can be held.
Well, I've since publishing Queering Kinship, the book that we're going to talk a little bit more in depth about later today. I've spent the last year. Books take a long time to actually come out, so this book was done a long time ago before it before it appeared. And as soon as I was submitted it, I started working on the next book project, which I've spent the last year really immersed in, which is a new history of the second century Christianity. And so I've been drafting chapters and been really thinking, really re-entering this scholarly world, doing a deep dive. I had published a lot on second century Christians, but I was kind of like, okay, now here's what I actually think about all of these things. So this is a premature, early preview of all of that. But basically the book is talking about all of the ways that Christians end up adopting the values of their Roman persecutors. And a lot of, I think, the negative things that we find in Christianity can be traced to these years of the kind of unsympathetic perspectives that Christianity comes to adopt from my perspective. So it becomes very pro-slavery. It becomes very anti-Jewish. It starts to subvert women's authority. There are a number of
Hmm.
instances where the church is kind of adopting some of these values, and I'm trying to tell the history of that. And so for me, I guess maybe I'm in a low point with my with my relationship with early Christianity, is feeling like, oh, here's all the ways that they got it wrong. So
Oh.
anyway, in a couple more years, we'll come back, we'll
Well,
talk
yeah,
about
we'll
all
come
of that
back
in
and we'll
more.
talk, have you back on to talk about that. Well, I mean, yeah, because in my mind, I'm thinking, well, isn't that kind of like a great apostasy then? In one sense.
It's an interesting problem that I'm trying to wrestle with, is how to not fall into the trap of saying, and this is the evidence of the great apostasy.
Okay.
But But yeah, anyway, more to say about that all later. But yeah.
I say, well, I just love biblical scholarship. I love having some of the top biblical scholars on. So when I get the chance to pick somebody's mind, I'm going to do that because I just am really curious about this stuff. So I guess so now I just so I have some understanding of your context here. Obviously, basically typical Mormon upbringing. You're born in the covenant. Go to to serve your mission. You do all this kind of stuff. You're a straight male. Um, how does a straight male from your generation um, find talk about your development and understanding of queerness and sexuality, at how you would have viewed it at a younger age and how you view it now, and where did this happen where you got into this arena where you're writing books such as this?
Yeah. Uh, you and I might be close to the same age, or late 40s or so. I don't want to
Yep.
presume, but
Yep.
yeah, yeah.
So Gen
So
X, and
yeah,
we know what it was like in the 90s and stuff. There's a deeply homophobic, just in general. And
absolutely, absolutely. And there were big conversations that were happening at the time around, what was then called gays in the military and the don't ask, don't tell policy and the very early days of same-sex marriage politics in Hawaii and California in the late 90s and early 2000s. And so these issues had come onto my radar as a high school student. And as I mentioned earlier, I was on the debate team and we were debating issues like sexuality and feminism. And I was kind of wrestling with reconciling some of the perspectives that I was developing as a kind of maturing young student with the conservative background that I was coming from as a religious person. And, I kind of always put those issues on the shelf a little bit. I took some great classes on feminist literature, some great classes on sexuality. I'd read Judith Butler in high school and in college. Um, but by the time I got to grad school, I was kind of like, wait a second, I can talk about both of these. I can talk about gender and religion at the same time. And I was really sort of a late bloomer, maybe in that perspective. And I realized that at Harvard, I was at this place that had this amazing historical legacy of pioneering scholarship on gender, sexuality, and religion. And I started looking around. I was like, oh, that's what that person. Oh, that's. And I thought, oh, maybe I could do something like that as well. So my dissertation and my early scholarship was actually about gender and sexuality in early Christianity. And so I started studying these things from an academic perspective. And at the same time that those things were going down, that my research was going on. The church was engaged in the anti-same-sex marriage ballot measures, especially Prop 8 in California. And it sort of dawned on me that a lot of the scholarship that I was studying for gender and sexuality and religion would be directly relevant to the conversations that were happening within the Latter-day Saint tradition. And so I kind of started dipping my toes in. And as I mentioned earlier, I was never intended on having a career writing about this stuff. But I wrote one article about maybe I think in 2011 or so is when that came out. And it was called Towards a Post-Heterosexual Mormon Theology. And it was in many ways my response to the frustration that I felt as a scholar of religion, a scholar of gender and sexuality, sort of just coming to the beginning of my career with trying to read, well, what are all of the other smart people saying about all of this, and feeling somewhat disappointed with them. And again, people were definitely doing good work, and I was building on other things that they had said, but I felt like there was pieces of the conversation that were missing, and I wanted to try to fill in some of those gaps. So I came at it really as a from the perspective of this is an important social issue and one that deserves the highest level of kind of academic attention and care that was often lost in the culture war battles that were happening online. That was sort of shallow analysis through all of that, and I felt that that I might be able to elevate the discourse a little bit to say something that was maybe new or different, bring some different perspectives to this conversation from again a love of the academic study of these things, and that's I think sort of the core identities and backgrounds that I bring to it.
yeah, and then of course just speaking to the cultural wars and stuff like that, that's this it's still simmering obviously in this space. And so I'm just curious, without mentioning names or anything like that, I would just like for you to just talk about how by entering into into this area that I imagine you would catch some flack from some people. Maybe talk how much have you received much flack for this, attack from people, or what's generally been the
Yeah.
reception?
Yeah. Most people who disagree with me don't tell me. So that's fine. I don't get, every once in a while I'll get an email or something like that, or there are some, some trolls on Twitter who come after me. But for the most part, it's not a super prominent part of my life is the opposition. In fact, I've been very pleased that people have received my work positively. Um, uh, my earlier work has been assigned at courses all around the country. I hear from many Latter-day Saints that they have appreciated it and grown from it and learned from it. So for the most part, I would say that the reception has been overwhelmingly positive, and I've been very, very pleased by that, despite the fact that I'm dealing with some controversial issues. And I think that part of it is because I'm really committed to a reasoned, rational conversation about things. I try to avoid incendiary, to the best of my ability,
Hmm.
incendiary approaches to this, and try as best as I can to model what a scholarly tone is about these conversations. And I think that that's been for the most part successful.
Yeah, and I think that's what we're trying to do here at MBR too, is to model how we can have civil conversations. I tell people like 99% of the people I have on, in one sense, I disagree with them, being coming from an evangelical worldview and having my own views on things that are maybe somewhat heterodox in some corners. And so I've learned to be able to navigate. So yeah, generally speaking, I've been positively received as well, with the a few exceptions of people in certain corners. And actually on page 21 in your book, you actually talk about exploring the possibilities and imaginaries of a lust for kinship, in addition to the four turns in queer theory that Moore, Britnall, and Markov sketch out. They propose a fifth, the theological twist. So this is kind of what you're adding into this, because often queerness and all this is often equated to secularism, and you wanted to kind of let's explore theological avenues in this context as well. Maybe speak to that.
Yeah, yeah. I think that that was one of the core frustrations that I've had for many decades now, as I've started studying these things, is that feminist thought, that queer thought, that discourse about gender and sexuality in the popular realm and often in the scholarly realm have been taken to be secular and secularizing discourses or approaches to the world, and that therefore religion, and especially conservative religion, has positioned itself in opposition to issues around gender and sexuality. And that frustrated me as a historian, because looking back at the history of Christianity, I saw many instances in which Christians were directly engaging these questions, as well as a kind of um, uh, 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 what's the right word? I guess a disservice to the many religious people who were deeply committed to feminist values or LGBTQ rights and values, and that religion and sexuality, or religion and gender equity, were not things that were in conflict for them, but rather things that were mutually informing. And I wanted to sort of honor that perspective, as opposed to just conceding that religion always had to and always must take an oppositional stance in relationship to these things. And so this is my efforts in this regard. I think have been both to kind of tell the history differently, as well as to approach the theological aspects within the LDS tradition as offering maybe some alternatives that people have not fully explored.
Yeah, and so talk about the contributions that LDS theology, also maybe even just its view of God, and just and how kind of like what did you describe it as, uh collapsing sacred distance, how maybe and also the idea of adoption, and how in Mormon theology, especially in the 19th century, and then also kinship. Speak
Yeah.
speak to these things.
Yeah. Let me start with the last one first, because the idea of kinship for me has really become a central point of beginning, I guess. I think that not only as a matter of deeply important values that our culture and other cultures have of a special relationship of care, trust, love, support between kin is something that we need to give deep attention to and honor as a society, but also that Latter-day Saints in particular have given a lot of attention to this issue of defining who is kin, establishing that as a theologically significant relationship, one that will persist in the eternities. And so I really wanted to start with kinship as a kind of foundational idea of not only as a matter of ethics, but a matter of theological attention that I think is really central to the LDS perspective. And starting from that idea of kinship, what are things that then flow from that? What are ways that we can maybe see and understand the human experience in creating these deep and lasting bonds between kin, between among generations, among peers, inside and outside of the quote unquote biological family, that these all became significant relationships to theorize a little bit more. And so I start with there and therefore sort of subverge, that's not the question, submerge, that's the word, submerge gender and sexuality as actually being secondary. I think if we put kinship as the sort of primary place where we're thinking and where we're devoting our attention, that gender and sexuality become less important in that scheme, and we can start to see the way that kinship can encompass and enclose a variety of different genders and sexualities, rather than being the boundary that breaks them. Okay. So I'll get it. We can get into that in a little bit more detail, but that's really is kind of the starting point of the values that I'm beginning with, both as a claim about what Mormonism and what the Latter-day Saint tradition is about, as well as I think the kind of more important set of moral questions that we should be asking about kinship and relationships to those who are near us. So you would then ask, okay, well, what does this have to do with God, and what was the other question? Oh, about collapsing sacred distance and so on. So most of your listeners, I'm sure, are aware that Latter-day Saints have a distinctive perspectives on the nature of God, and this comes from sort of the end of Joseph Smith's life as he kind of is unfolding some of these ideas, especially in the Garden, in the Grove, the Sermon in the Grove, and the King Follett sermon, and a few others, where he's developing this idea that God is a human being, and that we are the same species as God, and that we can become just like God. Now, this is a radical break from the traditional Christian tradition, where divinity and humanity are mutually exclusive categories, and the miracle of Christianity is the overcoming of that barrier between divinity and humanity in the person of Christ. Okay. Mormonism takes a perspective entirely differently, which is that the person of Christ is not ontologically unique, but ontologically paradigmatic, that all human beings have the potential to become like their Father in heaven, and can sort of progress towards that through the miracle of Christ's atonement and so on. So I think that starting point of thinking of God as a human being, of thinking of the heavens as a social space where we relate to others to whom we love, is a really important understanding. Maybe it's not theologically viable, and there are some real questions about that. But as a moral perspective, I think it really grounds Latter-day Saint thought in this unique place of again focusing on relationships. And I look to the relationship between the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit as a relationship of kinship, one where they have entered into an everlasting covenant, one which is based on love, one which is based that they are all three separate beings with three separate identities, but yet nevertheless come together in this shared covenant of love in order to create, to expand their love to others. And I see that that's the core of the sort of kinship relationship as well. And so I look to the unique elements of LDS theology as actually providing some really interesting insights and potential for prioritizing kinship as a value in LDS thought.
You also talk. Let's talk about Heavenly Mother in this sense too, and also how you argue that there's a lot of it's a very heteronormative and what's views on things that have been the tradition within the church as well, but also how Heavenly Mother kind of is another interesting dynamic in this conversation.
Yeah. So, if you look at the way that Latter-day Saints have imagined the traditional Godhead of the Father, Son, and the Holy Spirit, it's actually quite homoerotic. And I talk about this as a homoerotic, there's a lot of homoerotic tension in this deep love between them. And if you look at the way that some LDS theologians and LDS leaders have talked about it, they use a lot of homoerotic language to describe that relationship. And I think that the way that Heavenly Mother enters into this for many Latter-day Saint thinkers is to sort of diffuse that homoerotic tension, right? It's like, oh no, well, they actually have a wife at home. Okay. Yeah, it's the three guys, they're all hanging out all the time and, making worlds and making, humans and stuff. But he's got a wife at home, so he's straight, right? And so in many cases, I think that the LDS a tradition about Heavenly Mother has been used not always to just expand the place and make a place for women in the heavens, but specifically to reinforce heteronormativity and heterosexuality. And I want to push back on that tradition a little bit. One which both honors and respects the place of women in this tradition, as well as not giving up on or so easily getting rid of that homoerotic tension that still exists. So I look to a number of different ways where we might again return to some of those homoerotic themes while still allowing for the Heavenly Mother tradition. And one of those places you mentioned earlier is around the LDS notions of adoption, which are widely practiced in Joseph Smith's at the end of Joseph Smith's life and in the latter part of the 19th century as well. And this is a tradition which is, I think, fascinating and it's deeply confusing as well. But it's where a lot of adults were adopting other adults to be a part of their family, and they were being sealed to them with the exact same sealing ritual that would seal any parent to any child, biological or not. And so these adult adoptions were a way of, again, kind of expanding those kinship networks. Okay. And I find that there is actually this tradition about the role that Heavenly Mother and Heavenly Father play in the premortal realm as well, rather than, again, it's a deeply problematic idea that develops in the context of Mormon polygamy, but that Heavenly Mother's job is to just have baby after baby after baby after baby, right? But there's an alternative tradition, which is that Heavenly Father and Heavenly Mother are adopting pre-existing spirits, and they're adopting them into their family. And so this notion of again a kind of expansive adoptive network rather than one which is built on heterosexual reproduction has deep roots in the LDS tradition, and I think help us to kind of envision a broader way of conceptualizing kinship and a broader ways that we might imagine divine relationships.
So, and of course, another thing that we have going on here is experimenting with non-traditional forms of marriage, which would be through polygamy and in some cases polyandry. Maybe speak to that because I think that's really a key thing here too.
Yeah, so there's a funny irony, of course, for Latter-day Saints that who have this tradition of deep rebellion against the Victorian family, and so much so that they went to war against the United States, hot and cold war against the United States for this objection to the Victorian family, and yet have adopted it in the 20th and 21st century as its model. But I think that tradition of recognizing the limitations, the imperfections, the problems with the quote unquote traditional family as it emerges in the Victorian era, uh, is very much a part of the Mormon story. And so I'm curious to kind of looking back at that as potentially a model, not to redo what they were doing. I think I have a lot of problems with the way that Latter-day Saints were practicing their expanded forms of kinship during that time period. I think that we need to be critical of those as well. At the same time, honoring that tradition of the insights that they brought to what their protest was all about and why they why they were unsatisfied with the family as it had been conceptualized by their Victorian peers.
Hmm. And so I guess, it's really, I find this to be a very interesting book. It's challenging at times. I will say, a lot of more traditional conservative minded LDS and evangelical folks would probably be kind of bothered by some of the stuff that's in this
Yeah.
book. It would make them feel uncomfortable. And so I just want to let people know this is a challenging book, but I think it's interesting because I think it's really important to get these different perspectives. And actually it's so fascinating to me to hear because I talked to you on the phone yesterday and I was like, when your Tabernacles of Clay first came out, I remember when it came out, and I think you may have been interviewed on Gospel Tangents with Rick Bennett about it, I think, if I'm not mistaken. And I just assumed that you were a gay man because you're writing this queer stuff. And I'm just kind of following up the question I asked earlier. You kind of answered it, but I really want to know on a personal level, what made you interested in specifically in this topic as a straight male?
Yeah. I think that I'm disturbed that more people aren't thinking about it, that more people aren't
Mm,
giving this the attention that it deserves. It is one of the most pressing issues of our day and has been for 50 plus years at this point. This is one of the biggest social cleavages that our society faces. As you alluded to earlier, things are not getting better. We're facing dramatic reversals of rights for LGBT people in this country as of right now. The divide between LGBT folks and conservative religious folks is growing every day. We are seeing, we have seen in the past epidemics of suicide, of violence. This is one of those topics that deserves our utmost attention. And if we can't figure this out, then we're really in for a long, troubling future ahead. So I think that I just think that this is something that we have to be thinking through, and we have to give it our fullest attention. And I do that as not as somebody with a personal stake in the sense that it directly affects me
mhm.
or a member of my family, but because I care about our society, I care about our religious tradition, I care about our democracy, I care about people who are suffering, and I want to give it my best.
So that's fascinating, and also maybe talk on your personal journey because in growing up, would you have been kind of a homophobe? Or did you always feel like did you support like I know a ton of people that supported Proposition 8, back in the day that now have since rescinded that. But can maybe talk about your personal evolution on this topic?
Yeah. I'm quite sure that I would be embarrassed about positions that I held back then, and I am quite sure that I said or did things that I would not be proud of today. And at the same time, I don't recall there being like a dramatic conversion story for me either, of where I was like, oh, now I have seen the light.
Okay.
I think I held relatively liberal positions on some of these issues, and definitely was kind of thinking through them all the way back in high school, thinking about issues related to justice, related to identity, related to the nature of sexuality, the nature of love, relationships, a tolerant society, a tolerant religion. And so, again, certainly my perspectives have evolved and changed as I began to study these things in school and in graduate school. I knew people. I went to New York City for college, and obviously knew many LGBT folks there. Met the first person that I had actually known who contracted HIV during those years. When I went to graduate school, I met my first real live trans person for the first time, who was a doctoral student at Harvard. And that person taught me so much over the years. I had queer colleagues and teachers in graduate school. And so I think I those were really formative years for me. It just being realizing like, oh, other traditions and other religious people are thinking deeply about these things, and they've been able to reconcile those. One of my trans friends that I mentioned became an Episcopal priest and was the first trans Episcopal priest, right? And so I was like, oh, this is fascinating that other traditions have kind of addressed this, and this is how they're doing it. And I wanted to bring, it was sort of maybe my moment of holy envy of like, I wanted to bring the same level of sophistication and the same level of care that I was seeing happening in my friends' churches as I was in graduate school with all of these other people who were being ordained in their traditions, or who were deeply committed to their traditions. And I wanted to see, well, what can they teach me here? And so those were maybe really formative moments, not necessarily of like having been an avowed homophobe or hate, or anything like that, but more like, oh, here's what they're doing. Let me see if I can learn from that.
Beautiful. I think that's great. I love that. And we've been having interesting conversations with ministers from different churches on this channel. I've had queer pastors on, transgender people, and and there's also within Mormonism, there is movements like Rob Lauer's Reform Mormonism movement. I know that Evan Sharley, she's engaging in kind of creating a type of Mormonism that's open for everybody in the LGBTQ community. We're seeing experimental stuff going on. Also, the idea of experimental religion is so at the core of Mormonism that it enables for people to kind of go off and even Sonia Johnson, who is a leading feminist Latter-day Saint, ends up starting a polygamous lesbian group, and so there's always been this exploration of gender roles and sexuality, even with the polyamory, the polygamy. Even I remember Evan saying, well, Steve, it was because this is an interesting conversation. How I said how it seems so odd to me that people who leave the church, it's either because they become a Mormon fundamentalist and they become polygamous, or they leave the church and they end up becoming polyandrous. It's like, and Evan said, Joseph Smith was the one that introduced the idea of non-monogamy into this whole conversation.
There is, I absolutely agree. There's a funny irony, I suppose, in the kind of return to these early Mormon traditions that many people who leave the main branch of Mormonism end up following for one reason or another. I think that that definitely is a fascinating element that we are seeing in real time.
I remember few years ago, I was talking to Matt Harris. We were having a conversation about the church and gay marriage. And this was probably about 2 or 3 years ago now. And we were just talking, I think it was at Mormon History Association, and we were talking about it. And I said, this is and when I say this, I'm being descriptive, not prescriptive, because I tried to be very neutral on this channel. But I just told Matt at the time, I said, I can see that in the next 10 to 15 years, the church making accommodations for gay marriage. And I said, I think what it will take is when some major evangelical groups end up embracing gay marriage, then the church would feel more comfortable doing it. Because if the church were to do it now, they would get a lot of flack from the evangelical church. And so I don't think they can do it. But I think that 10, 15 years from now, and I think there will be a softening that occurs in the evangelical world just because the next generation and they just have different views on this kind of thing. So I kind of think that is kind of where I see it going. Now others have pushed back on me and said they don't think so, but Matt seemed to think so. And also maybe like works like this might contribute to that conversation as well. Maybe what do you see like happening in the next 10, 15 years in this space?
Yeah. It's hard to predict the future, and every historian will tell you that they, can tell you all about the past, but not
Right.
not about the future. And so, who knows? Okay, but here's the way that I tend to answer it. Tend to answer this question is that there are a few different options that we might see the church pursue. One is the model that many people kind of look to of the question of race in the priesthood. And Matt Harris's history, cannot recommend it highly enough, of kind of giving us the behind the scenes version of all this. And you see the way that the church leaders were fiercely debating this behind the scenes for decades before any change happened. So that's number one important, is that these debates were actually happening. And so it didn't necessarily come out of the blue, but it was a real reversal. And so it's possible that we might see a long-standing conversation that's happening behind the scenes result in a reversal of some sorts. The other option is, I think, what happens with the push for women in the priesthood, which is that there may be conversations that have happened behind the scenes. We don't have any access to those, but the perspective that the church has ended up adopting there is less going to be a reversal. And I don't expect we'll see one anytime soon either, but more an accommodation to the degree that they feel comfortable. So we'll see women praying in general conference and women giving more speeches in general conference and women having a greater role in ward council and various other ways to kind of accommodate more participation, more authority for women, but still stopping short of a full acceptance of women in the priesthood. And it's possible that with same-sex relationships, we might see something along those lines where the church is willing to accommodate up to a certain point, but they're never going to be sealed in the temple or something like that, right? And that's a possibility. It's also possible, and I think that if anything, the Trump years have taught us quite a bit that there is no clear direction of progress, that we're oftentimes going to be going backwards to, and that the anti progressive values have deep roots in this country and certainly in the LDS tradition. And we might see, reversals of progress that we've seen as well, where the church sort of digs its heels in, and we might look to to the era before polygamy was undone, of the church sort of really digging its heels in. Now, maybe the lesson of that is that they ended up reversing themselves later on, right? But that was a time where they were like, we are never changing. And there's nothing you can do to us. You can lock us up. You can do whatever you want. You can, and that's the rhetoric that the church leaders are adopting now on this issue. They're saying, we will give up BYU accreditation. We will give up our good reputation in society over this issue. This is a doctrine that's never going to change. And that's where in many respects the church is at currently. So I can't predict which way what it will look like 5 to 10 years from now. I think anything is possible, certainly. But there are so many other factors, and maybe your prediction is as accurate as any, that when and if other major churches that have previously been LDS allies on this issue start to reverse their position, that we might see some change here, and that would give some cover for the church. But who knows? Who knows? I mean, the allyship between Catholics, evangelicals, and Latter-day Saints is a very fragile one. Mm-hmm. And it could be, as you said, that as soon as one of them changes on this issue, that alliance breaks apart, and then there's so who knows? Who knows? I certainly can't tell you.
Yeah, it is really hard to predict. And again, this is the other thing, is that, when you're the church and you're looking at these mainline Protestant churches that have gone progressive, just politically and theologically, they've also noticed that those churches are dying.
Yeah.
And they could even point out, well, look what's happened to Community of Christ. It's not going. I mean, unfortunately, it's a sad story to see what's happening with the Community of Christ. But essentially, the argument is, if you want to actually have a healthy church that's growing, or that is not, at least not shrinking or just imploding, that having conservative traditional values is actually an asset.
This was definitely like the sociological theory that Rodney Stark and others in the 70s, 80s, and 90s really, really pushed. And, it's called the strict church theory. And the idea is that, exactly as you said, that liberal churches were in decline, conservative churches were on the ascent. And, we see massive growth of the Latter-day Saint tradition during those years. We see massive growth of the Pentecostal tradition during these years. And so many sociologists were sort of looking to this as the sure explanation of things. Now, the last decade and a half, the idea that conservative churches are growing is no longer true. And despite the optimism that I think many Latter-day Saint leaders have, that growth is inevitable here, that doesn't seem to be held up by the actual numbers, and certainly not by people's experience. So I think we're seeing the death of the conservative church theory, of the strict church theory, and what emerges in that is hard to say. Now, it's worth pointing out that in the first half of the 20th century, The liberal churches were growing, and it was the conservative fundamentalist churches that were nowhere to be found. They were definitely on the losing end. Society looked down on them greatly. They were off doing that. They started their little teeny Bible colleges in the middle of nowhere as their kind of rebellion here. But they did not have the dominant force whatsoever. It was the liberal and liberalizing churches that were the dominant force. And in the post World War II era, those things switch. What the future looks like? Will we see liberal churches sort of be able to capitalize on this moment, and conservative churches will be on the decline? I don't know, right? But I'm resistant to ideas that I think that LDS church leaders and other conservative church leaders bought into the strict church theory maybe a little bit too hard, and it is backfiring right now in my perspective, backfiring quite severely. That it's not only that younger people are leaving or becoming uninterested, especially because of a divergence of these social values, but that these churches are considered um, to be forces for evil in the world. It's not just I'm not interested anymore. It's now the church's positions on some of these things have so turned off and so polarized younger generations who see the church's involvement on some of these issues as immoral, that I think that it's really weakened the churches, the broader capital C church of Christian churches in general, their standing in society, and I worry for the longer term future of the effects of that.
Yeah, there's so many. It's hard to read a lot of this stuff too, because when you look at, and again, this is a neutral channel, so I don't get into partisan politics here, but when you look at the fact that 18 to 24-year-old males voted 20 points in favor of Biden last time, and then Trump won by 2 points. When you look at the European elections, in which 4 years ago or 5 years ago, whatever, the Green Party had a huge surge, primarily through youth, but now the nationalist parties had rose greatly, and that was primarily through the youth vote. So
Yeah.
it's not this simple trajectory. Well, these youth are going to come in, and it's going to get more progressive. Actually, it seems to be shifting even among young people too, which I find very interesting, and I didn't see that coming.
I think everybody's been a little bit surprised by that. Absolutely. And I think that what we see is like that, 20% in the middle where there's going to be a lot of radical swings, right? But the 40% on either side are actually still, I think, growing further and further apart. And I think it's that polarization that I'm especially concerned about as well.
So getting back to kinship, um, speak to that. Like, what role can kinship play in our modern world?
Yeah. Well, I think that there are a couple of important ways that this helps to resolve some of the problems that Christians in general and Latter-day Saints in particular have come to approach this. And one is that we it's funny because you and I grew up in the same era, and we talked about things like homosexuality, right? And that this was somehow distinct from heterosexuality because the ways that heterosexuals got together is that they got married and they had children and family, and the way that homosexuals did is they went to gay clubs and had anonymous sex, and didn't care about family or any of that kind of stuff. And what the same-sex marriage movement really, and why I think it was so successful, is challenging that presupposition that there is somehow a different set of values, a different set of social needs, a different set of standards of care that people offer. When you fall in love with someone, you fall in love with them, and you want to, self-sacrifice for them, and you want to care for them in their when they're sick, and you want to care for them when they are getting older, and you want to be a part of all of that, right? And so having that basis of relationships is not something which is distinct by sexuality, but I think is rather a much more closer to universal set of presumption, or not of presumptions, of impulses. Um, Now, I put a lot of qualifications around this part of in the book because I think that it's also really important to recognize that there isn't one way to do kinship. And why I talk about kinship and not family is that I don't want to reinforce a particular model of like married parents and, raising two children and they live separately from the grandparents. There are all different kinds of ways that human societies have formed kinship, have thought of the most efficient or the most beneficial ways of doing that. And I'm open to not only thinking of Latter-day Saint theology as encompassing a broader set of practices of kinship around sexuality, but around the global variety of ways that people might practice kinship that are not reducible to like the modern family as we might stereotype it. So I think that getting past this idea that sexuality is somehow a kind of dividing line between different practices of kinship, and rather starting to see kinship as a wide variety of ways that people form these relationships of care, and then giving those the theological and ethical attention and respect that they deserve, to acknowledge the deep love and care and commitment that people have, and perhaps even to celebrate it by sealing people in the temple, right? Is one of the options that I kind of wanted to explore a little bit by building Mormon theology from that foundation of kinship as its central value.
Well, the name of the book is Queering Kinship in the Mormon Cosmos, again, published by the University of North Carolina Press. Taylor, I just want to thank you so much for coming on to the program today. And I guess if I maybe we can wrap this up with, if I'm let's just say I'm a typical Latter-day Saint and I'm, maybe a cisgender male or whatever, just a conventional Orthodox Latter-day Saint. What what do you think that they could get out of this book that could be useful for them in their faith journey and having a better understanding of um, LGBTQ issues and such?
Yeah. I think that when I wrote, well, there's a longer answer. Okay, there's a longer answer. I first started writing queer theology, as I said, 10, 12, 13 years ago. And the response that I got back then was, okay, well, maybe that's all theoretically possible. I sort of see where you're coming from there, but the history and tradition can never change. And so I wrote Tabernacles of Clay about the history to destabilize that history and to say, look, the history has changed all the time. There is not a single perspective that Latter-day Saints had around gender and sexuality. It's changed. Here's how it's been shaped by the social forces around it rather than it being consistent. It's actually often reactive to the things that are happening. And so I really wanted to destabilize that history. In Queering Kinship in the Mormon Cosmos, I come back to the theology to destabilize the idea that the only valid perspective that is available in Mormon theology is one which vaunts heterosexuality as the highest form of relationship. And they say, look, they're all look at this, look at this, look at this, look at this, look at all of these other ways in which the tradition has been and can be more expansive than it currently is. And as an intellectual exercise, I think it's important for Latter-day Saints to be aware that there are a variety of possibilities within the tradition that we might follow. Some of those are good, some of those are bad, but I want us to be able to have the conversation about not whether or not it's possible, but whether or not certain perspectives are good and valuable and worthwhile pursuing. So starting with that destabilization in order to sort of clear the decks and say, let's start from this question of what is good rather than what is possible. Because I think that what the book helps to show is that we can envision a variety of different possibilities, and then we can ask the question, well, what's the best one?
Great. Well, I love it. Well, thank you so much, Taylor, for coming on. It's been a blast talking with you. It's good getting to know you a little better as well. We see each other at conventions, Mormon history, and other places, and it's good to this was even just as much for me as it is for the audience. And I just want to thank you so much for coming on. I want to wish you happy holidays and Merry Christmas. It's all coming up. You got the tree in the background there. I hope you have a wonderful holiday season.
Hey, it's been a huge blast to get to talk to you finally after all these years, and appreciate you interviewing me about the book and look forward to future conversations.
So just a reminder, we're going to have links in the description for those of you who'd like to purchase the book. There also will be links in the description for those of you who'd like to financially support the channel on PayPal, Venmo, and on Patreon. And I want to thank all those of you who are financially supporting this channel. Could not do it without you. And remember, this is the most important thing. All the voices of the restoration will be heard here on Mormon Book Reviews.